Hi, I'm picking up from where we left off at this very, I think, useful table looking at consequences and how these consequences affect responses and behaviors. Um, I think I need to say a couple of words about what's a reinforcer and what's a punishment. What are good reinforcers? Good reinforcers are, first of all, you may think that chocolate is a good reinforcer, and I'll tell you outright it is for me. But if you're allergic to chocolate or you don't like candy, a reinforcer, chocolate will not work as a reinforcer. So the first thing you need to be aware of is that just because you think something should reinforce a behavior, it doesn't mean that it will. You really need to look at what has occurred. If you use chocolate as a reinforcer and it works, all the better. If you use chocolate as a reinforcer and that's not working, you need to try something else. What else might this person find pleasant? There are two kinds of reinforcers. Broadly speaking, what I just talked about with chocolate is a primary reinforcer. Food, um, meeting physiological needs, those are primary reinforcers. And then there are the reinforcers that we learn and we've come to appreciate. Socialization with others, uh, comes anything material, material things, gifts, gold stars. We find all kinds of things in education to use as reinforcers. Sometimes we put off doing the most pleasant activity of the day till the end, so we might do some activity we find a little less pleasant, followed by an activity that is more pleasant, and that's called the pre-met principle. It's like when grandmother said, if you eat your peas, you can have the apple pie. So again, that kind of activity is a pre-met principle. Uh, Verbal rewards, that good job, I really appreciate that. Those kinds of statements are positive uh, reinforcers if they work. And also intrinsic reinforcers. The example I used previously about you being excited about reading the textbook was actually not an external reinforcer, but an internal one. The pleasure of it, the joy of it, the joy of learning. Now, there are also different kinds of punishers, but I just want to mention that their punishment is usually not a very effective technique. When you're looking to change a behavior, and you might need to reframe it in terms of not decreasing an undesirable behavior, but increasing the simultaneously incompatible behavior that is an increase. So if I want to stop Johnny getting out of his seat in the classroom all the time, I might think about, rather than punishing him, which I'll just tell you is not going to work in the long run. It will work in the short run, but not in the long run. And if it worked, we wouldn't be building more and more prisons every year. Punishment does not work. Increasing a behavior is a much surer way to get the result that you want. And instead of saying, I am going to punish Johnny for being out of his chair, think about rewarding Johnny for being in his seat, being near his desk. And so that is the best strategy that I can suggest to you or anyone, parent, teacher, spouse, significant other. These are things you might want to think about. I've added a few concepts here. I'd like you to think about how operant theory can lead to superstitious behaviors. Um, and I want to note that there's some concepts I want to describe to you. One is shaping. Because it might have occurred to you, well, all well and good, you want me to reinforce something that somebody's done, because I'd like to see that behavior again. But what if the behavior hasn't occurred? What if you can't reinforce Johnny because, well, Johnny's never in his seat? We can begin to shape behaviors. And we shape behaviors by rewarding or reinforcing successive approximations of the desired behavior. So, and you can read about this in your text and other places as well. I think it's a very interesting idea, but what you do is you begin to reinforce behaviors that approximate the desired behavior. So if Johnny is all over the classroom, I may begin to reinforce him when he's within, let's say, 3/4 of the classroom near a seat. And then very slowly I begin to reinforce him, provide reinforcements as he gets closer and closer to his desk. Again, these movements tend to be very slow. You can't really jump all going from I'm going to reinforce him when he's way across the room to his desk, because he may never be near his desk. So you want to make these reinforcers or shaping behaviors gradually. And, sometimes we do this intuitively. When you're teaching somebody a skill or a technique, you don't expect to reinforce or provide a reinforcer for the exact behavior. Slowly, a person learns a behavior and you begin to reinforce the behavior as it gets closer and closer to the desired behavior. Again, chaining comes into play, and you'll see that in a little bit when we talk about complex behaviors. How do we get someone to put two behaviors together? Because some behaviors, like learning to swing at a golf club, more or less successfully, can be learned through reinforcing each part of the swing. So we chain that together. And finally, as in classical conditioning, there is extinction of a behavior. We talk about reinforcing a behavior, either positive or negative reinforcement, to increase the behavior. But at some point, unless it's well established, that behavior can become extinct. And so what we're going to look at in just a moment are strategies for both learning the behavior and preventing extinction of a behavior. And we do that through reinforcement schedules. So right now, because as I've mentioned, reinforcement is really the only way to maintain or to learn a desired behavior. Punishment is not a good strategy. Reinforcement schedules have to do with increasing the behavior. Now, we could get someone to do something by every time they did it, we'd reinforce it. I think you see right away the fallacy of doing this for any extended period of time. If you're using M&Ms in the classroom, you would run out of M&Ms and all your students would have gained a lot of weight, and that's not a desirable thing. When might you use a continuous reinforcement? Well, I think you'd use it in the very beginning, and I think that makes sense. Then you might want to transition to some kind of intermediate reinforcement. And there are two types of intermediate reinforcements. One that uses time as the variable, and the other that uses the ratio or the number of occurrences of the behavior. So let's look at time. And if you keep this slide in mind, let's go to the next PowerPoint slide here. And we'll look at some examples. A fixed ratio. Now, a ratio are the number of occurrences. An algebra teacher announces, as soon as you've done 2 problems in a row correctly, you may start on your homework assignment so that you'll be able to finish by the end of class. What's the fixed ratio? 2 problems correctly in a row. Fixed ratios are the kinds of things where you might think of an assembly line job where you get paid for every X number of widgets that you produce. That's a typical fixed ratio. A variable ratio is using the notion of the occurrence of a behavior, but it's not at a fixed point in time. typically it's really at an average point in time. So I might think to myself, well, I want to reinforce this, but I don't want to reinforce it every 2 times. I might want to do it on an average of every 5 times. And so I might reinforce something like the first time that it occurs, and then maybe the 5th time it occurs, and then the 8th time it occurs, and the 9th time it occurs, and the 3rd time. So that's a variable ratio. It's a very powerful strategy for developing resistance to extinction. A very good example of a variable ratio is what casinos use with the slot machines. People are not rewarded after every 2 times. We'd be all standing up at the slot machine to do that. It's at some number that's unknown to us. People feed the quarters in. I assume they're quarters. I'm not really sure anymore, having only done this once. But feeding money into the slot machine, then pulling the lever, and at some point in time, or at some occurrence, I don't want to say time, at some occurrence, there's a reward. There's a reinforcement of that behavior. And the reason that people continue to play the slot machines is that we don't know when that will happen. They don't know when that will happen. And it's a very seductive and intriguing way to keep a person doing something. It takes a long time for no payout to occur for a person to walk away in general. Just as we use number of occurrences, we can use time. We have a fixed interval. A faculty or a teacher can give a quiz every Friday. And the reason it's a reinforcer is we know you're going to get an A. So that's using that example. Or you might get paid every Friday or every other Friday or once a month. And again, this is pretty susceptible. It's a good way to get people started on something, but it's pretty susceptible to extinction. Think about if you got paid every Friday, how many days would you show up to work when they didn't pay you the previous Friday? You might go an extra week, but that's it. And so that's the notion of it's better than continuous, which is every day, but it helps the behavior get going, but it's very easy to extinguish that behavior. On the other hand, a variable interval behavior is a variable interval time is very resistant to extinction. Think about your studying habits. If you know the teacher gives an unannounced quizzes, will you not study more often? I like to use fishing as an example for variable interval, having gone through this with my husband. Is that you get up at 4 a.m., you go out on the boat, you begin fishing, and you're there, and you're just hoping, oh, we're going to come in now, and you catch a fish. And then it goes on, and you're thinking, okay, certainly we're done now, and whoops, some point another fish comes. And so you're really hooked. Not only is the fish hooked when you catch them, you're hooked, because any time now, we're going to get another fish. That's an example of a variable interval reinforcement schedule. And I'm going to stop right now for a moment because it looks like I'm going to need to go into another unit, and I'm going to finish up by talking specifically about how these ideas are used in the classroom in creating instruction. Thanks. Be right back.